chapter 5, chapter 5, chapter 5. Slavery as it relates to the slave trade and how it started and why it began. To understand the African slave trade, we must understand slavery as an institution as old as human society. Every people, sometime or another, have been slaves. In fact, Europeans enslaved other Europeans for much longer than they enslaved Africans. Slavery was a permanent feature of the ancient world in Egypt, Kush, and Rome. The African slave period is best known to us because it is best documented. It is the best documented. However, these documents are often confusing because they were created by people who were trying to justify the slave trade. Most people, especially Europeans, who created most of the documents on slave trade, write about the subject with the intent to make the victim of slavery feel guilty and vindicate the perpetrators of the slave trade. There is probably more dishonesty related to the interpretation of this subject than any other subject known to mankind. The African slave trade, like African history, is often written about but rarely understood. This misunderstanding probably grows out of the fact that we nearly always start the study of African slave trade in the wrong place. The germ, the motive, the rationale for the African slave trade started in the minds of Europeans in the 15th and 16th century. The slave trade could not have started at all had there been no market for it. The slave trade started when the European began to expand into the broader world. The market was created by Europeans for European reasons. The story of the African slave trade is essentially the story of the consequences of the second rise of Europe. In the years between the passing of the Roman Empire in the 8th century and the partial unification of Europe through the framework of the Catholic Church in the 15th century, Europeans were engaged in mainly and in internal matters. With the opening of the New World and the expulsion of the Arabs and the Moors from Spain during the latter part of the 15th century, the Europeans started to expand beyond their homeland into the broader world. They were mainly searching for new markets, new materials, new manpower, and new land to exploit. The African slave trade was created to accommodate this expansion. The basis for the European Industrial Revolution had already been established. They had already created embryo technology, including the gun, in the years that followed. They also used other advantages, mainly a large fleet of ships and rabble soldiers and sailors with no sentimental attachment to European people to take over most of the world. In doing so, they destroyed a large number of nations and civilizations that were older than Europe. The main problem with the African in dealing with the European during this period was the African's tragic naivete. He never dealt extensively with this kind of people. He came out of a society where nature was kind. Nature furnished him enough food, land, enough of the basic things he needed to live a pretty good life. These old African societies were governed by honor and obligation. Land could neither be bought nor sold. There were no fights over ownership of land. The land belonged to everyone. The European, coming from a society where nature was rather stingy, where he had to compete with his brother for breakfast, his land, his woman, had acquired a competitive nature that the African simply could not deal with. In order to justify the destruction of these African societies, a monster that still haunts our lives was created. This monster was racism. The slave trade and the colonial system that followed are the parents of this catastrophe. The Europeans, mainly the Portuguese, who came to the west coast of Africa in the 15th century, were not at first looking for slaves. The search for gold and treasures lured them to Africa. They did not have to fight their way into the continent. They came as guests and were treated as guests. Then they grew strong. They decided to be conquerors, and they turned on their hosts. Another myth we have is to dispel that Europeans came to spread civilization. Actually, most of the great civilizations in Africa declined after the coming of the Europeans. For years, the Europeans have been hearing rumors about African cities of gold and beautiful women. There were also legends circulated in Europe about a great emperor in Ethiopia called Prester John. But when the Portuguese arrived in Africa, Prester John had been dead for 300 years. And they looked for him on one side of Africa, and he had been on the other side. But no European came to Africa to tame any raw savage. When the Europeans first saw cities of Africa, they reported these cities were well designed and that the African was civilized to the marrow of his bones. 50 years later, when they wanted to justify the slave trade, they started myths about the savage Africa with no organized societies, no cities, even no knowledge of the wheel. The European did not enter Africa to bring civilization. In fact, no nation ever invaded another nation for any reason other than to exploit that nation for its own resources. This is true even when whites invade whites. It's true when browns invade browns. It's also true when blacks invade blacks. The intent of every invader, no matter what his color, is to establish his own way of life. In nearly every case, the local culture suffers. This happened when the Europeans invaded the west coast of Africa. We have their word that they did not meet an uncivilized people. We also have their word that they encountered not only well-organized societies, but societies that had a great deal of order and beauty. In 1434, a small fleet of Portuguese ships sailed down the coast of Africa and established some trading posts. By 1441, they were taking some of the tropical riches out of Africa and also a few slaves. They brought who had been prisoners of war captured in some local skirmishes among the Africans. By 1482, they had built fortresses in Alima Castle, the beginning of forts built by Europeans along the coast of West Africa to protect themselves from Africans when the slave trade was established. In fact, the slave trade did not get underway until the Europeans had these fortresses built. And while building the forts with the help of Africans, they were telling the Africans that they had come to deal honorably in trade, and the native Africans believed the story. These fortresses actually served as holding stations for slaves they were shipping to the New World. Incidentally, the Scandinavians entered the slave trade after the Portuguese, but they did not have any appreciable success, and they became middlemen in the slave trade. Then, when the Arabs and the Moors were expelled from Spain, they returned to Africa. After being masters of the Mediterranean for 750 years, they had no sentimental attachment to Africa. They began to prey on nations south of the Sahara, principally the old empire of Songhai. They first claimed the salt mines, for the salt was then so precious that traders gave 2 parts of gold for 1 part of salt. They sent troops from what is now Morocco down into the sea. The fight over the salt mines and Tangier on the edge of the Sahara Desert became a great political and economic struggle. But something else happened too. Christopher Columbus had, by sheer accident, started to look for the East Indies, and instead he found what was later called the West Indies. A new world was open to the Europeans, and they promptly began their exploitation. We are at chapter 6. We are at chapter 6. We are at chapter 6. Chapter 6 is time of troubles. Time of troubles. We are at chapter 6. Time of troubles. We're reading Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, Slavery and the Rise of European Capitalism, written by the Dr. John Henry Clark, Professor Emeritus of Hunter College in New York City. America's time, Africa's time of tragedy and decline started, both in Europe and in Africa itself. For more than 1,000 years, Africans had been bringing into being empire after empire. By the opening of Europeans' era of exploration, Africa's own internal strife, and the slave trade turned what had been Africa's golden age into a time of troubles. The Crusades may be called the beginning of Europe's reawakening, a religious fervor not unrelated to politics had stirred Europeans out of their lethargy and their indifference to the larger world. The First Crusade began in 1095 and was precipitated by Seljuk Turks, whose persecution of Christians had placed even Constantinople in jeopardy. The eastern heads of the church appealed to the Pope Urban II for help. At a great church council in France, the Pope pointed out that if Constantinople fell to the Turks, Western Europe would soon be overrun. He made an eloquent plea to the kings and the princes gathered, and to all Western European Christendom to rally to the aid of the Christians in the East and to drive the infidels from the Holy Land. This religious crisis gave Europe a semblance of unity. And although it can be said that the Crusades were military and religious failures, they did provide the opportunity to bring new information to Europe. These religious wars also had a profound effect on the political development of Europe. The Western monarchs were able to strengthen their authority and develop a strong central government, while many members of their turbulent aristocracies were fighting in the Holy Land. Contact with the East had a deep and lasting effect on the Crusaders, who belonged to a civilization where culture and learning had almost vanished during the Dark Ages. The princes in their castles and the peasants in their huts were equally ignorant and uneducated. When they arrived in the East, they soon realized how backward were the people of the West. They marveled at the beautiful cities, the thriving commerce, the busy industries, the arts, and the learning. The impetus for exploration was fueled by what the Crusaders met along the way. Ships built to ferry the Crusaders to the Holy Land returned laden with products from the East. The cargoes of spices, fruits, rich silks, satins, velvets, and other luxury goods found a ready market. Thus the Crusades brought into being the first attempts to open fresh trade routes to the East. Early in the 15th century, Europeans' search of new worlds to conquer and of a food supply to feed the continent's hungry population began to venture across the seas. North Africa, by 1492, North Africa was confronted with the painful face of its waning influence in the Mediterranean Europe, Spain, and Portugal, which had broken the yoke of North African domination, were asserting themselves as powerful, independent nations with colonial aspirations in the lands of their former conquerors. Islam, a great religious and military force in North Africa, and the Middle East since the latter part of the 7th century was torn apart by internal strife and bickering. The relationship of North Africa to the people of the Western Sudan was deteriorating. For hundreds of years, this relationship had been good. Africans from the Western Sudan had participated in large numbers in the conquest of Spain in the year AD 711. These Africans made up the major military force that kept Spain under North African domination, and they participated in the country's intellectual life and is still reflected in Spain's art, culture, and literature. In order to understand this neglected aspect of history, the role of Africans in the conquering and the ruling of Spain, it is necessary to go back in time, retell, at least briefly, the part that Black African histories played in the rise of Islam and in the spread of Islamic influence in Mediterranean Europe. After consolidating their position in Spain, the Muslims began to establish institutions of research and learning, whose brilliance was far beyond Spain's borders. This was an achievement not of the Arabs alone. It was brought into being by a combination of Africans and Arabs, collectively referred to by Europeans as Moors. The word Moor entered the vocabulary of the Europeans meaning blacks, as in blackamoor. By the end of the 14th century, Southern Europe had gained enough strength, military and otherwise, to challenge their African and Arab masters. By the end of the 15th century, the Arabs and the Moors had lost all of Spain except the Kingdom of Granada. The Christians, although they had also had their internal disputes, were finally united. The marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella joined the formerly hostile royal houses of Aragon and Castile, and together their forces blockaded the city of Granada. After 8 months, the Moorish governor finally surrendered. This marked an end of an era. Europe had literally been reborn. The Africans who had planted the seeds of progress in Southern Europe had not made the best use of the harvest that followed. The progress and excitement that had inspired Europe during the 15th century had carried medieval Europe over into the modern world, had brought no progressive changes to North Africa, now rocked with conflict. In the countries of North Africa, especially in Morocco, political stagnation seemed to be the general rule, and strong men with selfish intent found their opportunity to seize power. They no longer protected the poets and the scholars. They left no monuments to embellish the conquered cities. To North Africans, the 15th century was a time in which Spain was a lost and hated land, a century in which Portugal robbed North Africa of a large part of its western seacoast. The news in 1492 of Christopher Columbus's discovery of the New World came swiftly to the courts of Fez, Marrakesh, and Cairo, and was cause for rejoicing. Chapter number 7. We are reading Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, Slavery and the Rise of European Capitalism by Dr. John Henry Clark. Sorrow in the New Land. When in 1492, Columbus, representing the Spanish monarchy, discovered the New World, he set in train the long and bitter international rivalry over colonial possessions, for which after 4.5 centuries, no solution has yet been found. Portugal, which had initiated the movement of international expansion, claimed the new territory on the ground that they fell within the scope of a papal bull in 1455, authorizing her to reduce to servitude infidel peoples. The two powers, to avoid controversy, sought arbitration, and as Catholics, turned to the Pope, a natural and logical step in an age when the universal claims of the papacy were still unchallenged by individuals and governments. After carefully sifting the rival claims, the Pope issued in 1493 a series of bulls which established a line of demarcation between colonial powers of the two states, colonial possessions of the two states. The East went to Portugal, and the West went to Spain. The partition, however, failed to satisfy Portuguese aspirations, and in the subsequent year, the contending parties reached a more satisfactory compromise in the Treaty of Tordesillas, which rectified the papal judgment to permit Portuguese ownership of Brazil. The above quote from Eric Williams' neoclassic work, Capitalism and Slavery, first published in 1944, places in focus an international situation that started in the latter part of the 15th century. This is still alive and with us on the eve of the 21st century. Michael Bradley's book, The Columbus Conspiracy, is well-researched. Inquiry is a well-researched inquiry into this event that changed the world for all times to come. This event set in motion the Atlantic slave trade that made it possible for the economic rise of Europe and the expansion of the influences and domination of European people throughout most of the world. Christopher Columbus is best known for a number of Western thugs and murderers who has been presented to the world as a hero and a discoverer. A future examination of his action will prove that he had no regard for the people he encountered on the islands in the Caribbean. He did not appreciate their initial friendship toward him and his crew. A fact that is often overlooked is that a large number of crew of the 3 vessels of Christopher Columbus were criminals, let out of jail to go on this voyage because it was difficult to recruit others because of the apparent danger of the mission. The following extracts taken from the Journal of the First Voyage of Christopher Columbus, 1492 to 93, Eric Williams on page 52 clearly indicates his attitude toward the indigenous people of the Caribbean islands and the Africans he had previously met. The Portuguese generally referred to the west coast of Africa as Guinea. It also indicates that Christopher Columbus could have been a participant in the early Portuguese slave trade. Number 50, entitled The Enslavement of Aboriginal Indians. Friday, the 12th of October. They should be good servants. From the Journal of the First Voyage of Christopher Columbus. They should be good servants and intelligent, for I observed that they quickly took in what we said to them Sunday, the 14th of October. Some people were very simple as regards to the use of arms. As your highness will see from the 7 that I caused to be taken, to bring them home and learn our language, and to return unless your highness should rather them all be brought to Castile, or to be kept as captives on the same island, for with 50 men they can all be subjugated and made to do what is required of them. Monday, the 12th of November, yesterday a canoe came along the ship with 6 youths in it. 5 came on board. I ordered them to be detained. They are now here. I afterwards sent them to a house on the western side of the river and seized 7 women, old and young, and 3 children. I did this because the men would rather behave better in Spain if they had women of their own land than without them. The following comment is taken from a speech entitled "It's Time We Rethink Our History" by David R. Stidham at the first celebration of African American culture and history at Stratford High, Nashville, Tennessee, and published in the CLC Report, March 1990, pages 6 through 8. When we began to rethink our history, we understand why history books are wrong. We are all miseducated. Columbus did not discover America. The historical facts in December 1492, Columbus was totally lost, wandering about the Caribbean islands thinking he was in Asia. When he was discovered by the native Arawak Americans who lived in these islands, actually it was the Arawak's ancestors who, 50,000 years before Columbus, discovered the Americas when they walked across the land bridging the Bering Strait. Columbus didn't discover anything. He was so confused and lost, he thought he was in India. He called the Arawaks Indians. Christopher Columbus was considered a saint by the European who held his great so-called discovery. We need to rethink our history. Columbus was no saint, and the Arawak were not uncivilized savages. Like the African who came to America before and after Columbus, these were gentle people with a rich culture who worship one creator. When we began to rethink our history, we began to put into historical perspective the true role of Europeans in our 500-year history. The perspective and the wealth, the good human European lifestyles we enjoy today in America began in 1492 from its infant beginnings. This prosperity grew out of slavery. You see, slavery did not begin with the importation of African people to America. Slavery began with Columbus. The first slaves were not Africans, but Native Americans. Columbus wrote in his journal about the inhabitants of Haiti, the present Haiti. All the inhabitants could be taken away to Castile, which is Spain, or made slaves on the island. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. In truth, that is exactly what he did. Columbus enslaved the gentle Arawak Haitians, forced them to give up their gold and their land. After all, he had discovered, quote unquote, these riches. They were his for the taking. After all, he had discovered the riches, they were his for the taking. What is also true is Columbus took hundreds of Arawak slaves to Spain, where they were sold or they died. They didn't freely go with Columbus to meet the king, as my history books lead us to believe. In his quest for gold, Columbus had the hands cut off of any Arawak who did not bring in his quota of gold. In a short 40 years, the entire people of Haiti and 500,000 Native Americans were wiped off the face of the earth by Columbus and the Spaniards that followed him. No, Columbus was no saint. We need to rethink our history. Non-European people, especially Africans in the indigenous Americas, in the Caribbean islands referred to as Indians, initially attributed to the Europeans the humanity and a spirituality that they did not have and still do not have in their relationship with most of the non-European people of this world. This was a weakness in dealing with the aggressive Europeans. And to some extent, it still is. Christopher Columbus was the forerunner of the European aggressor, the land grabber of today. They have justified this action in this regard in the name of God, using the assumption that people were being brought under the influence of civilization. This indeed was a contradiction, because the act committed against these people was uncivil. When a people assume that their God approves of their criminal action against another people, they have made God ungodly. In many ways, the European misuse of religion has destroyed the spirituality that was initially the basis of all religion. The Carib and the Arawak Indians were curious about Christopher Columbus and his crew, and at first treated them as strange and new guests in their homes. They did not know that soon after their arrival, the guests would turn on the hosts and make them slaves. The destruction of the Caribs and the Arawak in the Caribbean island through disease, rape of their women, and sometimes out-and-out murder, destroyed the labor supply on these islands and made it necessary for the enslavement of the Africans. In his book, The Disruption of the Indies, Father de las Casas estimates from 12 to 25 million indigenous Americans were killed on the island in the Caribbean. The school books that indicate that Christopher Columbus was on a civilizing mission are a disservice to the students and teachers who would be in rebellion against them. Christopher Columbus and his crew would have formed a successful partnership with the Indians. Would they have been to benefit both of them? While Christopher Columbus still prevails as a major hero in the Western world, sometime in the not too distant future, if African and Indian scholars who are descendants of those who were murdered start writing books about the opening up of the New World and the starting of start using new and old documents, especially the work of Bishop de las Casas, Christopher Columbus will emerge as one of the greatest villains of human history, which indeed he was. When this revelation becomes apparent to the most of the world, I still think there will be a need for Columbus Day, but it will be a justifiable day of mourning for millions of Africans and so-called Indians who died to accommodate the spread of European control over the Americas and the Caribbean islands. Christopher Columbus had helped to set in motion the Atlantic slave trade, the greatest single Holocaust in human history. Most modern-day scholars who have a one-dimensional view of history, mostly partial to Europe, are not ready to consider the fact that the pre-Columbian presence of several different national groups before Columbus, going back as far as 1000 BC, Professor Ivan Van Sertima's book, They Came Before Columbus, the African presence in ancient America, is clear on this subject. The Vikings came in a hurry and obviously left in a hurry. They left little evidence of their culture, of their art, no evidence of their literature. This must have been a culture in transition. The pre-colonial presence of Orientals in the New World has been alluded to and partly documented in a number of books, such as Ancient Egyptians and the Chinese presence in America. And Columbus, And Columbus was Chinese discoveries, inventions of the Far East by Hans Brewer. The early meeting of Africans, the Orientals, and the Indians was a complementary infusion of culture today. Could be a lesson for the whole world because in all that we have learned in documents, there wasn't even one hint of war between these cultures and people. This brings us to a conclusion that might be difficult for a lot of people to accept. Maybe the world outside of Europe didn't need Europeans in the first place. Maybe fakery about spreading civilization, he destroyed more civilization than he ever built, and he did more harm to the world than good. What I learned from reading this literature on this subject is that this early meeting between indigenous Americans, Orientals, and Africans was a laboratory in human relationships because it proved that different people of different cultures and religions dominating and colors can coexist, can complement each other without dominating each other or attempting to destroy each other. We find the personality of Christopher Columbus and his associates constantly reoccurring in the early part of this drama about the opening of what is referred to as the New World. Little emphasis is placed on the fact that Christopher Columbus wasn't too clear about where he was and knew nothing about the people he met in the lands he allegedly discovered, quote unquote. Instead of being a meeting of cultures and an amalgam of cultures complementing each other by infusion, Christopher Columbus set in motion a tragic clash of culture that has not ended to this day. This clash of cultures is caused by the arrogant assumption on the part of some Europeans that they are the only people who produce anything worthy of being called culture. The following entry in Christopher Columbus's diary was taken from the Diary of West Indian History, from the Spanish diary to the British conquest of Jamaica. And it gives us another note, quote, in Williams, page 4. And I quote, Tuesday, the 15th of January, the intercourse at Carib would, however, be difficult because the natives are said to eat human flesh. The admiral determined to go up there, and as it was on the route, and thence to Montenegro, which was said to be entirely peopled by women without men, he would see both islands and make some of the natives, and might take some of the natives. In his entry of the 5th century January, Christopher Columbus infers that some of the people at Carib, Puerto Rico, are cannibals. This is one of the most persistent myths coming mainly from Europeans, using it as a rationale to reduce some non-Europeans people to servitude. This charge is often made and rarely proven. Automatically or ironically, the charge of cannibalism is more often charged to a people who in their society have more than an adequate supply of non-human meat. Those making the charge generally come from a society that has been historically short of non-human meat. From this deduction, I leave to the individual reader to arrive at his or her own conclusion. Monday, the 18th of February, he pretended to have gone over more ground to mislead the pilots and the Marines, who picked off the charts in order that he might remain master of the route to the Indies, as in fact he did, for none of the Others kept an accurate reckoning so that no one but himself could be sure of the route to the Indies. In his entry of February, there's a clear indication of the description between Christopher Columbus and his pilots. If he originally set out to go to the Indies, why did he go to the West Indies? This is why the indigenous people, the Caribs and the Aurochs, are referred to as Indians. This aspect of the Columbus saga begs for investigation. Over and beyond the Christopher Columbus hero worships who have written in library books about the complex individual who we still do not know. In chapter 2 of his book, The Columbus Conspiracy, Michael Bradley goes beyond the personality of Christopher Columbus and deals with the personality that were previous explorers in Americas, such as the Carthaginians, the Phoenicians. In this speculation, Michael Bailey is not only telling us more things that we need to know about early exploration, he is also telling us about human curiosity in relationship to exploitation. In his chapter, in the book entitled Echoes of Ancient Truth, Michael Bradley alludes to the late development of the nation state in Europe and the still slower development of a uniform language and culture that Europe could understand. One to another. Today, this would seem like a contradiction because in most textbooks and in mass media, Europe is represented to the world as though he arrived culturally pure and endowed with a knowledge and the mandate to lead the world. What Michael Bradley has said in this chapter is that Europeans, like all other people in the world, had to endure a long and hard struggle before arriving to a state and a condition that she could justify what is being called civilization. Europeans lack understanding of most of the peoples of the world, mainly because they lack understanding of themselves. In a previous chapter in this book, Michael Bradley takes up a more dangerous issue. The issue deals with the impossible Jewish input into the New World discovery and the medieval roots of internal religious conflicts in Europe affecting a segment of the Jewish population who might have distinguished themselves as Catholics. He alludes to some misconceptions we might still have about the personality of Jesus Christ, his early life and relationship to the Jewish people of biblical times. This chapter is found most topical and historical roots, putting on the agenda for discussion of some little-known aspects of the Christian story and its relationship to the role of the Jewish people in world history. This chapter, carefully read, might start debates, fistfights, and some of the like or the right. Bradley alludes to the assumption that the royal house of France could have been Jewish and that the Jewish bloodline came into Europe in this manner. This information, while generally unknown, has been known and debated by a select group of scholars for at least 40 years. I am of the opinion that these scholars think that people don't understand their academic circle and are not intelligent enough to understand the truth about history. Michael Bradley has dared to put some forbidden subjects on the agenda for discussion. He has rendered a service that he will not universally be thankful for, but it is a service nonetheless. After reading this chapter, I strongly suggest the reading of two very neglected works by Alvin Boyd Kuhn. Who is this King of Glory? In my opinion, one of the clearest books written on the Christ story and shadow of the 3rd century. Another ably written book about the early rise of Christianity. He concludes this chapter with a statement that Columbus seems to have been born of a heretical family. The points that I have been alluding to are summarized by Michael Bradley at the close of chapter 3. Godefroy de Bouillon wanted to create a new Jerusalem in the Holy Land, where the three great faiths of the West would be reconciled. He failed. But this sort of crusade is what apparently motivated Christopher Columbus and his supporters and financial backers. His voyage may have been a crusade to establish a new Jerusalem in a new world. And I think this is the light in which we should view his motivations. It is also a perspective that a light will permit some insight into the anomalous facts and unlike consequences of life. He seems to have been a part of an accident, noble conspiracy to create a world of religious toleration between the Christian, the Jew, and the Muslim. A new religion, period. That, I think, was Columbus's concept of a crusade, and the only one worthwhile kind of crusade. Attempts to unravel Columbus's mystery have not been left to only a few scholars. There's been long debates on whether serious questions raised in the academic circles without appreciation, public attention being raised. African American scholars such as J.A. Rogers, Carter G. Woodson, William Lee Hansberry have raised this question in their works and in their essays. And I quote, The Origins of Racism in America by the Caribbean writer Jan Crew. In the book, Africans, Themes, Northwestern University Studies, in honor of Gwendolyn M. Carter, Ibrahim Abu Luhab, the editor, Program of Studies of Chief of African Studies, Western University, Illinois, 1935, page 3. It refers to the Columbus exploitation of the New World was possibly the origin of present-day racism. He stated in a statement as follows: "It is extraordinary that in the 482 years since Afrikan Holocaust of San Salvador rediscovered Columbus and his sailors on the beaches, so little research has been done on the origins of racism in the New World. This paucity of research is all the more astonishing when one considers that patterns of race relations and systems of caste, color, and class have not changed a great deal in the 4 3/4 centuries since the Columbian era. But before examining the subject of racism in the New World in Columbian times, we should consider briefly two important early visits to the New World. The first 5 centuries before Columbus, Norsemen sailed to Greenland, Labrador, and points south of St. Lawrence Estuary. And in the pre-Columbian times, Africans visited the Americas. The most notable expedition taking place, Era chronicles tell us that in 1310, when the Emperor Mali determined to extend his empire beyond the western reaches of the Atlantic shores, he sailed with 400 ships to the New World. The shadow persecutors of both Columbus and the African slave have had a distinct bearing on the subsequence of his events and played significant roles in laying the foundation of a new civilization in the Americas. In chapter 5 of this book, Bradley maintained that there could have been 2 Columbuses, one being the master pirate or French descent, the other being Christopher Columbus of history. He points to the documents that made him arrive at his conclusion and the circumstances that end to prove that the truth of his conclusion is a possibility. In chapter 6, Michael Bailey alludes to the possibility of Jewish origins of Christopher Columbus, and that the purpose of his voyage had a mission extending beyond discovery and the search of gold. He points to some evidence that tends to indicate a religious meaning for the voyages that rooted in some of the conflict and mysteries around the origin of Christianity. Michael Bailey has put on the agenda a subject that might start another crusade, a crusade to kill Michael Bradley in order to shut him up. To fully understand Michael Bradley's book, it might be necessary to go away from the massive information in the book, new and old, and look upon the period of European history from 1400 to 1600. After the Crusades, the period of plagues and famines, Europe had lost 1/3 of its population. The Africans and the Arabs, who had been controlling Spain in the Mediterranean since 711, were still in control, though control had begun to weaken. Europeans were sought of food and the ability to preserve food. They wanted, indeed, to access to spices, sweets, preservatives of Asia in order to continue to survive. This is a period when some of the conflict between the various factions of the Catholic Church was settled by the marriage of Queen Elizabeth and Ferdinand of Spain. It was also the period when Spain regained her sovereignty and drove out the Arab and African colonial masters, collectively called the Moors. Spanish were looking for ethnic and religious purity, and therefore expelled the Jews along with the Arabs and Africans of Muslim faith. This was not only a turning point in the history of Europe, it was a turning point in the history of the world. This period not only saw the rise of the Atlantic slave trade and the European civilization of most of the world, Europe Europeans subsequently began to colonize information about the history of the world. They colonized complementary images and began to infer that whiteness was the image of God or goodness. The most tragic aspect of colonial image was their colonial image of God and the characters in the Bible. This is the period when Europeans began to infer that the world was waiting in darkness for Europeans to bright the light. This book has both historical and topical meaning. This is very much with us today. Totally aside from opening the Caribbean islands, North and South America for the European exploitation, Christopher Columbus has set in motion the rationale for the destruction of the indigenous population, and he mistakenly referred to them as Indians. He had stimulated the Atlantic slave trade. The Africans were used as reasonable to replace the rapidly disappearing Indian. Chapter 8. Chapter 8. We are reading Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, slavery, and the rise of European capitalism. Chapter 8. Chapter 8. The Forged Migration. Chapter 8. The process of capture and transport was set in motion by the slave trade to change maritime history, economic history, and created an immigrant population in the Caribbean or the Caribbean islands and in the Americas, who were forced out of their homes against their will. The basis of this force was the need and greed of Europe. Their forced migration was a process that ignored the humanity of a large portion of humankind. This process, set in motion during the latter part of the 15th century, would last over 300 years until slavery turned into colonization and more sophisticated form of slavery. There is a need to know the look at this process. There's a need now to look at this process and how it was set in motion. Most of the information used for the examination of this article was taken from this article, African Slave Trade, The Cruelest Commerce, by Colin Palmer, professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. From Basil Davidson's Black Mothers, the Years After the African Slave Trade, and A. Adu Bohin, The Coming of the Europeans, Horizon History of Africa. To set the process in motion, the African was totally dehumanized in the minds of the Europeans. So far as most of them were concerned, the Africans were outside the grace of God. Africans became living commodities in a world trade system that laid the basis for modern capitalism. The Middle Passage, the condition of the transfer of the Africans across the Atlantic to the various parts of embarkation where they were to be sold, is the most tragic story of forced migration in human history. Europe took full advantage of the wars and conflicts between Western African tribes and nations and began to purchase some of the captives and prisoners of war as slaves. The kind of slavery that the European was about to introduce to West Africa had no relationship to the African system of indentured servitude. In the African system, the slave, usually a loser in a local war, he was not enslaved separate from his family, and no slave was sent outside of Africa. Some slaves with talent rose to be kings in the very house in which they had been slaves. The word slave in West Africa had an entirely different meaning than it had when used by the Europeans. The slave in Africa did not lose his or her humanity. Some African chiefs or kings became corrupt and went into slave trade because they wanted to. The Europeans sold firearms to one African group to either protect themselves from the capture or the capture of another group. The European gunpowder, powder, rum, and cheap bric-a-brac coming from the embryo of what would eventually become the European Industrial Revolution was traded for slaves. In every slave fort in West Africa, there is a door of no return. The captured slaves went out of this door to the bench and subsequently to the boats that would take them away from their home forever. The condition on these boats or in a chain gang in the south of the 1920s, the condition of these boats was beyond anything described in a concentration camp or a chain gang in the south of the 1920s. Professor Colin Palmer described the condition as the establishment of these slave-holding fortresses in the following manner. To facilitate trade, forts were established along the West African coast. The Gold Coast, contemporary Ghana, saw construction of more than 50 such posts along a 300-mile coastline. The larger forts were called castles. Among the best known was Elamina, in Ghana, was built by the Portuguese in 1492, but fell to the Dutch in 1637. Cape Coast Castle began by the Swedes in 1653. It was later held by the Dey or ruler of the Fetu people. It was captured by the Dutch in 1664 and by the English in 1665. This castle would accommodate more than 1,000 slaves. Professor Palmer further informs us that the Atlantic Passage tested bodies and souls to their limits. The human cargoes that arrived on wooden platforms, like books on a shelf, on various levels cramped in the hold, Rarely was there space for an adult to stand erect. Some had barely enough room to lie down. One ship's surgeon observed that the traders wedged them in so that they had not much room for a man in his coffin, either length or breadth. It is impossible for them to turn or shift with any degree of ease. Some traders, of course, realized that such crowding increased the incidence of disease and death. One agent of the Royal African Company complained in 1704 that inadequate space on the ship Postilion, the slaves are so large, and it being the general opinion that the slaves would not be healthy in a space of 3 foot, they broke up one of the platforms, which was reason she couldn't carry more than 100 slaves. 8 years later, the company advised its agents at Cape Coast Castle, pray lade no more than necessary to prevent mortality, which has often happened by crowding the ship with too many Negroes. Not until the 18th century did European countries engage in the trade set standards for the allocation of space to the slaves. It may be doubted whether the rules were obeyed. Fearing rebellion, ship's crews generally chained slaves securely in the hold, usually in pairs, the right ankle of one connected to the left ankle of another. James Penny, who commanded trading vessels for more than 20 years, recounted that when no danger is apprehended, their fetters are by degrees taken off. With so many bodies packed close together, the heat below the decks became unbearable. The air reeked of excrement and infected sores. By the 18th century, ships customarily had portholes to aid ventilation, wind sails to throw down a current of air and grating on the decks. But to the human cargo, the whole remained a fetid hell. A cruel philosophical argument developed among the slave traders between the concept of tight pack and loose pack. When the slaves were tightly packed on the ship, more could be loaded on, but more died. In a loose pack, more survived the journey because they had breathing space, because fewer slaves were packed on the ship. Therefore, when the slaves arrived at the port of debarkation, they were in a healthier condition. The argument would go over 100 years. There was a small library of literature on the Middle Passage, some written by captains of slave ships. The rationale and the pretense in England was that the slave was primitive, unchristian, and that slavery brought them under the tutelage of Christianity. Other slave trading nations took the same attitude. The best literature illustrating this rationale came from the Catholic and the Protestant Church. It is time we look, at least briefly, at slavery and what it referred to as the New World and how it developed. Chapter 9. We are reading Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, slavery, and the rise of European capitalism. Chapter 9. The slave trade in the New World. The slave trade in the New World. Africans were no strangers to the New World. They seem to have been in North America and South America long before Columbus. This is more than an assumption. Thanks to the research of Professor Leo Weiner, reported in his book entitled Africa and the Discovery of America, and the work of Harold G. Lawrence in another book called African Explorers in the New World. The first Africans who came to the New World were not in bondage. Contrary to popular belief, Africans participated in some of the early expeditions, mainly with Spanish explorers. The best known of these explorers is Estevanico, sometimes known as Little Stephen, who accompanied the Debaca expedition during 6 years of wandering from Florida to Mexico. The remarkable thing about Estevanico, who came to America in 1527, is that he was a remarkable linguist. He learned the language of the Indians in a matter of weeks. Because of his knowledge of the herbs and medicines, he was accepted as a deity by some Indians tribes. In 1539, Estevanico set out from Mexico in a party with Fray Marcos de Niza in a search for the fabulous, there it is again, 7 cities of Cibola. When most of the exposition, including Fray Marcos, became ill, Estevanico went alone and opened up what is known as New Mexico and Arizona. A number of historians have stated that Pedro Nino was one of the pilots of the command ship of Christopher Columbus. He was an African. In the discovery of the Pacific in 1513, Balboa carried 30 Africans who helped clear the road across the isthmus between the two oceans. In the coast of Mexico, and Cortez was accompanied by a number of Africans. Incidentally, one was the pioneer of wheat farming in the New World. In the exploration of Guatemala, Chile, Peru, and Venezuela, Africans arrived nearly 100 years before they reappeared as slaves in Jamestown in 1619. Thus, Africans were major contributors to the making of the New World, and they did not come culturally empty-handed. Many of the Africans brought the New World such skills as iron working, leather working, and carpentry. Before the breaking up of the social structure of the West African states, such as Ghana and Songhai, and the internal strife that made the slave trade possible, many Africans, especially West Africans, lived in a society in which university life was fairly common and scholars were held in reverence. In that period in Western African history, the University of Sankore at Timbuktu was flourishing, and its great chancellor, the last of the monumental scholars of West Africa, Ahmed Baba, reigned over that university. A great African scholar. He wrote 47 books, each on a separate subject. He received all his education within Africa. In fact, he did not leave the Western Sudan until he was exiled in Morocco during the invasion in 1594. My point is that there existed in Africa, prior to the beginning of the slave trade, a cultural way of life that in many ways was equal, if not superior, to many of the cultures that existed in Europe. And the slave trade destroyed these cultures and created a dilemma that the African has not been able to extract himself from until this very day. There were in the African past rulers who extended kingdoms into empires, great armies that subdued entire nations, generals who advanced the technique of military science, scholars with wisdom and foresight, and priests who told of gods that were kind and strong. But the bringing of the African to the New World, every effort was made to destroy his memory of having ever been a part of a free, intelligent people. The greatest destroyer of African culture, the greatest exploiter of the African, was the plantation system of the New World. The African was transformed into something called a Negro. The African was transformed, he was demeaned. This is the thing that is uniquely tragic about the African slave system. Of all the slave systems in the world, no other dehumanized the slave more than that started by the Europeans in the 15th century. Using the church as a rationale, they began to set up myths that nearly always read the African out of human history, beginning with the classification of the African as a lesser being. The Catholic Church's justification for slavery was that the African American was being brought under the guidance of Christendom, and that he would eventually receive his blessings. The rationale was that slavery was a blessing to the African. It was not. There were several competing slave systems in the New World. In order to understand the effects of these various systems on the personality of the African, we have to look at each one individually. In Cuba and in Haiti, often the Africans were the majority of the population. This is true in certain portions of Brazil. Therefore, the system operated differently in these cases. And although it was still slavery, the African had some cultural mobility. In South America and in the West Indies, the slave master did not outlaw the African drum. African ornamentations, African religion, or any other things dear to the African, or things that he remembered from his former way of life. This permitted a form of cultural continuity, Among the slaves in the West Indies, Cuba, South America, that did not exist in these United States. In the Portuguese area, the West Indies, and often in South America, the plantation owner would buy a shipload or a half of shipload of slaves. These slaves usually came from the same areas in Africa. They naturally spake the same language and had the same basic culture. Families in the main were kept together. If a slave on an island was sold to a plantation owner at the other end of the island, he could still walk and see his relatives. This made for a form of cultural continuity among the slaves in South Africa, Cuba, and Haiti that later made their revolts more successful than the revolts in the United States. In the United States, in the fight to destroy every element of culture of the slaves, the system was cruel. No other system did so much to demean the personality of the slave, to deny his personality, or to ruthlessly sell family members away from each other. The American slave system operated almost like an American brokerage system. If a person brought 20 slaves at the beginning of the week, he found himself short of cash at the end of the week, he might, if the price was right, sell 10. These men might be resold within a few days. The family, the most meaningful entity in African life, was systematically and deliberately destroyed. Both in South America, the slave managed to stay in his group and therefore preserve some of his cultural continuity. In spite of these drastic drawbacks, the Africans in the Americas, including the United States, made a meaningful contribution to the preservation of the countries in which he was a slave. Another neglected aspect of the African in the New World is the role of African women. Comparatively few white women were brought to the New World during the first 100 years. Many families of the New World originated from cohabitation between the white slave master and the African woman. Later, this same slave master, especially in the United States, made and supported laws forbidding his own children to have an adequate education or to sit by him on public transportation. In Haiti, the African woman sometimes had a kind of semi-legal status. In South America, especially in Brazil, sometimes white slave masters married African women, and she became a free person. These free women in South America began to maneuver their husbands in an attempt to lessen the harshness of the slave system. In the United States, however, there could be no such maneuver. In Haiti and Cuba, during this early period, were dominated by their mother countries. Wars were started within these countries to liberate them from their European masters. Africans made a meaningful contribution toward the early liberation of Cuba and Haiti and other areas of South America. They fought with Simon Bolivar for the freedom of South America and fought valiantly to free Haiti from domination of the French. In the United States, especially in the American Revolution, the African slave took the place of a white person who decided he did not want to fight and fought with the promise that he was getting his freedom afterward. Thousands of Africans fought in the American Revolution with this promise. And a little known incident in our history is that thousands of Africans fought with the British when the British made the same promise to the African, and the African believed him. Apparently, it depended on who got to you first. The African was a major contributor in the making of the New World. The economy of the New World rested largely on slave labor. For many years, 1/3 of the trade of the New World was with the small island of Santo Domingo, which later became Haiti. Haiti and other Caribbean islands also influenced the economic system of Europe. Slavery and the slave trade was the first international investment in capital. It was the first large-scale investment that was intercontinental. Many Europeans invested in ships and in the goods and the services taken from these African countries and became independently wealthy. But the slave revolts continued. By the end of the 17th century, the picture of slavery began to change drastically. Economic necessity, not racial prejudice, originally directed economic necessity, not racial prejudice, originally directed the African slave trade to the New World. Economic necessity. As early as 1663, a group of slaves joined a group of white indentured servants in a revolt. Some slaves took the Christian version of the Bible literally, believed that God meant for them to be free men. Slaves such as Gabriel Prosser in Virginia, who led a revolt of 40,000 slaves in 1800. In 1882 in Charleston, South Carolina, a carpenter named Denmark Vesey planned one of the most extensive slave revolts on record, but he was betrayed and put to death with many of his followers. In 1831, Nat Turner led the greatest slave revolt ever in Virginia. Slaves never accepted their condition passively. In his book, American Negro Slave Revolts, Dr. Herbert Abertheker records 250 slave revolts. So I got a little excited. Lord have mercy. Been down so long. We've been down for thousands of years to this BS. The slaves never accepted their condition passively. In his book, American Negro Slave Revolts, Dr. Herbert Aptheker records 250 slave revolts. The African slave and the Americans, in addition to assisting in the freedom and the economy of these countries, made a major contribution to his freedom. In the story of the rise and the fall of African states, and subsequently the slave trade, we're trying to deal with something much bigger than history itself. We're trying to deal with an old situation and a new situation, trying to address ourselves to the current cry for black history and black power. Black history and black power. Black history and black power. Our major point in this, the African people who became slaves in the United States have been many things in history, good and bad. They have ruled great nations and they have destroyed great nations. They are profoundly human and they have played every role in the human drama, from saint to buffoon. Slavery does not represent the sum total of our history. We are searching for a definition of our African heritage and to determine what it means to a people emerging from bondage into the light of freedom, re-entering the mainstream of the world history as participants. A good definition of heritage or history is something acquired or transmitted by the predecessor. It is also called legacy, tradition, and birthright. But when we speak of our people, perhaps a new and better definition is in order. In his book, Tom Tom, John Vandercook said a race is like a man until it uses its own talent, takes pride in its own history, and loves its own memories, it can never fulfill itself completely. Heritage, in essence, is how a people have used their talents to command the respect of other people. The ultimate purpose of our heritage and heritage teaching is to show our people how, through identity and through respect for themselves, they can work to liberate themselves from the old ties of bondage. A person's relationship to his heritage, after all, is the same relationship as a child to his mother. Lord have mercy. God have mercy. Lord have mercy. Chapter 10. Chapter 10. Chapter 10. The broader dimensions of the crises. We are reading Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, Slavery and the Rise of European Capitalism by the late Dr. John Henry Clark. Chapter 10. The broader dimensions of the crises. Dr. Clark writes, I have no great feeling for the Japanese and the new yellow racism that is developing among them. But I have some admiration for the way they recovered from defeat and dealt with their conqueror. They have never let their mind forget the nature of their defeat. Who defeated them and how? They knew without shouting, without holding a single mass meeting, that their enemy threw 2 atomic bombs on their nation. They have figuratively and literally asked the question. The Japanese were one of the 2 main enemies you had in war. Why did you throw 2 bombs on the Japanese instead of 1 on each enemy? In the rise of their own racism, they have properly interpreted the racism of those who defeated them militarily, but not commercially. The assumption is that they threw 2 on you because you were not white. They imprison your people because you are not white. The Japanese refuse to let their enemy take away from them their self-confidence and their idea of God. And they conceive as they conceive God to be. If a people can hold on to that, you can recover from almost anything. Now let's end by saying what we could have done to recover from the disaster of the world of Christopher Columbus and the world that he did not discover. During the concept of Caribbean Federation, first thing we should have done was to unify all those islands and have a common defense force. Therefore, there would have been no Grenada, no Panama invasion. It would have been a common currency, a common defense force, an economic union. What one couldn't produce, the other could produce. A common tax structure. Put them all together and look at the territory. Once you've developed a common unity and a common parliament, every state in the United States has its own legislature and local representation. Every state in the United States has representation in Washington. So having a common parliament for all the Caribbean islands does not keep them from having local things specifically to take care of local situations, as well as having a common parliament to take care of the island-wide situations. We have not dealt with the contradictions The concept of Pan-African was created by three Trinidadians, H. Sylvester Williams, C.L.R. James, George Padmore. Why is it that they could never unify Trinidad or a single island? The mission of Pan-Africanism was to unify the survivors of our Holocaust that Christopher Columbus and his associated European thugs set in motion. The Japanese sent their children to the leading schools of the world to learn all the necessary skills and to bring them home. Are there any foreigners building their airplanes or building their ships? They do it themselves. When you have to call your former master back to do the basic things for you, you are not free. You have re-enslaved and recolonized yourself. We spend too much time celebrating, too much time with our fist in the air, too much time talking about black power without having any of it. Go ahead, Dr. Clark. Alton Maddox has said the civil rights movement was a consumer rights movement. And indeed it was. We were fighting to consume somebody else's hamburger. We made white hotels rich by having our conferences there. All of the conferences that black people have each year would allow us to build 10 major hotels at once. We could employ each other. Looking at all the empty land, we do nothing. We could have a series of farms scattered over every state. We could raise our own food. It would be much better if we could stop eating out of the can all the time. We know what comes out of the ground. We've been putting Dr. Clark, talking from the grave. Dr. Clark writes, we could raise our own food. It would be much better if we could stop eating out of the can all the time. Dr. Clark writes, we know what comes out of the ground. Dr. Clark writes, we've a brother putting it in the ground, a brother taking it out, and a brother putting it on the truck. Look how many people you're employing. What did we lose everywhere? Dr. Clark says we lost the concept of nation responsibility. This is what has been taken away from us during these 500 years. This is the supreme tragedy of our mind in the world of Christopher Columbus. Or Dr. Clark writes to write, the world that Christopher Columbus did not discover. Programming our mind to convince us that we could not even make a safety pin. If you can't make a safety pin, you can't make a locomotive. We have to tabulate how many years we're going to be dependent on other people for basic survival. The beginning chip, sooner or later, will be I will close off your community and let nothing come in. Then what are you going to do? Not only have you not learned how to make a gun, you haven't learned how to fix one. All of these veterans coming out of the Army with all this skill, have you learned how to marshal that skill? How to tap that skill? These veterans could have gone to Africa and built some of the finest armies in the world. I've often said the black man, properly equipped, properly inspired, properly led, is the greatest human fighting machine that the world has ever known. However, our skills have always gone for fighting other people. Let's go to Africa itself. There are Africans educated in Africa with African money who are scattered all over the world. They want to be everything but Africans. They have turned Africa over to a bunch of thugs. Coup after coup after coup. Who is going to give Africa the stability that it needs? I maintain, and this might be away from the subject, that there is no solution for the African people except some form of pan-African nationalism. No matter how you cut it, no matter what island you are from, no matter what state you are from, no matter what religion you belong to, we must develop a concept of our Pan-Africanism that cuts across all religious, political, social, fraternity, sorority lines and allows for us to proudly face the world as one people. We must stop apologizing, stop imitating, and begin to innovate. For a people to be free, they have to produce one sacrificial generation. My goodness. This generation must be the role model for other generations to come. Maybe a generation will have to wear dungarees so that another generation can wear tuxedos. We haven't yet considered that. We have to seriously step back and think of what we need to do and how do we liberate ourselves from the plagues, cultural famines, misconceptions set in motion by the rise of Europe during the Christian Columbus period of the 15th and 16th centuries. How do we become a whole people again? I think we should begin by finding a mirror and liking what we see. If we can't like what we see, then we can't make each other whole again. It can't be just ceremony. Can't just decorate the outside of the head forever without putting something on the inside. Can't have war between men and women because no people can be free if one half of the mind of the people is tied up in conflict. It's going to have to be both of us or none of us. We're going to have to find some unity that stretches across ideology lines, cultural lines, accent lines, national lines. We're hung up with so many offbeat religions, none of which we have created. We're cutting each other into pieces, deserting each other, destroying each other based on ideologies of no consequence to us as a people. I remember as a little boy on a farm, I was churning until the butter comes to the top. I'm counting the churns, and I asked my great-grandmother, which one of those churns brings up the butter? All of them, my son, she said. Which one? No one, all of them. We have to realize that it is not worth the effort of any one of us. We have to realize that it is not the effort of any one of us that will lead to freedom, but the collective work of all of us who are sincere, that will ultimately, in the end, end in the freedom and liberation of our people and the indoctrination of our own children, so that they turn and will pick up the responsibility and create an age where you never have to call for freedom again, because there will never be any need to call for it. From that day forward, we'll always have it. This is our mission. And in turn, the legacy that we need to leave for our children, and still more beautiful ones not yet born. Our enslavement and the wreck and the ruin of the sovereign states of Africa started at the beginning of the colonial era. Our enslavement and the rape of the services of our countries helped lay the basis of present-day capitalism. Again, the Europeans have squandered their wealth on stupid wars and conflicts that could have been avoided. They have already proven that they have one mission in mind, irrespective of religion, politics, or cultural affiliation, and that mission is to dominate the world and all of its resources by any means necessary. The new rationale for this dominance is now called the New World Order. All Africans and other non-European people should be on alert, because a new form of slavery could be more brutal and more sophisticated than the slavery of the Christian Columbus era. Africans and other non-European people must plan to strategize for a new world order, distinctly their own, that will be developed by them and for them. Our mission should be not to conquer Europe, but to contain Europe within its borders, and let it be known that anything Europe wants from other parts of the world can be had through honorable trade. If we understand our mission, I think we will become aware of the fact that we are in a position to give the world a new humanity that will bring into being a new world, of safety and respect for all people, the Nile River civilizations of Africa gave the world its first humanity, its first belief systems, its first social thought, and its first philosophy. With the restoration of self-confidence, we need to say to ourselves, we did it once, we can do it again. Go ahead, Dr. Clark. Chapter 11. Chapter 11. Chapter 11. When will we memorialize the victims of our Holocaust? We are reading Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, Slavery and the Rise of European Capitalism. Chapter 11, when will we memorialize the victims of our Holocaust? It is unfortunately forgotten that during slavery and colonialism, Africa and its people suffered the greatest loss in population and cultural devastation of any people in history. There is no memorial calling attention to this event any place in all of the world. The Africans in Africa have not properly memorialized their loss. And the Africans outside of Africa, the major victims of slavery and colonization, have erected no edifices or monument to remind their children that some of them survived the greatest protracted crime in history. I maintain that the people of the entire African world, both in Africa and abroad, are delinquent in their responsibility to their ancestors until some proper memorials are erected in every place in the world where there is an African population. This subject is so big that it is frightening. I wonder why a people as large as we are, engaged in as many activities as we are engaged in, have waited so long to think of addressing ourselves to the subject, the middle passage, our Holocaust. It is our Holocaust because this is a Holocaust that started 500 years ago, and it is not over. We do not start to count at 6 million, we start counting at 60 million. And we have just begun to count. Now, I do not mean to negate the German and the European Holocaust. Whether the number was 6 or 6 million, even if it was 3 million, it was wrong. But if it was a problem started by in Europe by Europeans, then there is no comparison between this tragedy and our tragedy. This was the greatest single crime in the history of the world. Why haven't we memorialized our dead? The most It was almost like the crime of not burying them. Let's look at it historically, broadside, before we come to the subject. Why are we a people whom so many have said have no history, pursued by so many other people? Why is it that we have been a prize to be captured down through the years? It is because of a prevailing thing that prevails right now. African people have been under siege for over 3,000 years. For the same reason they are under siege right now. African people have always had and still have something other people want, think they cannot do without, and don't want to pay for it. You keep using the word apartheid about South Africa. It is a minor issue in comparison to the real issue. The real issue in South Africa is a form of economic slavery. It is Western domination of the mineral wealth of South Africa, subsequently the mineral wealth of the world. The assault on South Africa is the assault on Africa in general. It is an assault on the gold in Western Sudan, and there lies the major gold wealth of Africa. Except for it, the economic system under which you will not be the same or even reasonably the same. Let us go to the background of the tragedy, because very often you think that this happened quite by accident. Let's set the stage for what happened. It is too big for literature. Let's put it in the realm of theater. It was a world drama, tragedy, and it started inside of the European mind. Let us look at the 200-year turning point in our history, 1400 to 1600 AD. Let's look at where Europe was. Europe had just finished a period of the Crusades, one of the great phony charades in human history. They had nothing to do with religion. It was a political move to divert attention of Europe from the fact that the church had played so many games on the people that the people were about to explode and destroy it. So they found an issue to divert the people's attention from the fact, once they started them marching and going to rescue the Holy Grail, which wasn't even lost in the first place, they would forget that they'd been bled dry to build all those cathedrals so that all those priests and monks could live in luxury while most of the population in Europe lived in poverty. They would forget that Europeans had to a great extent enslaved Europeans. Feudalism was still rampant in Europe. Now, to divert their attention, they needed an issue. The Crusades, the rescue of the Holy Grail, the fight against the hated infidel became the great issue. The Africans and the Arabs had blocked the Europeans' entry to the Mediterranean since 711 AD, when the African general Tariq bin Zayed had conquered Spain. It was an African-Arab partnership. Now the Arabs write history. They leave out the Africans. And when Europeans write, they leave out the Africans. And when the Europeans write, they leave out the Africans. So therefore, if you want to get the story, you write the story. We at the end of this dominance, great flourishing period of scientific discovery. You assume that when Europe was having its Middle Ages, everyone was having theirs. There were people in the world who had no Middle Age, no age of backwardness, no feudalism. Those people were in Africa. Inner West Africa and Western Sudan. Three great magnificent states, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, unfolded while Europe was having its period of depression. The last of these states was now reaching the apex of its grandeur. In 1415, the Portuguese tacked on a part of Morocco, a little place called Ceuta. And for the first time, a European had taken over some African territory. This put heart in Europe because they had at last invaded the territory of what they considered to be the hated infidel. At this juncture of history, everyone not of your own chosen religion was considered to be an infidel. The European Christian called the Arab an infidel, and the Arab called Christians infidel. They had been capturing each other in the Mediterranean, but for the first time, the European Christian had taken some of the land from the African. In 1450, the African and the Arabs were having an argument in Spain. This argument was weakening their hold on Spain. In 1455, Spain and Portugal had gained enough freedom from African Arab domination on the Mediterranean to go to the Pope to seek arbitration, because they now were getting colonial ambitions of their own. They said, once we are free of Moorish domination, what are we going to do? They were now talking about what part of the world that they were going to take. The Pope, settling the argument, said, you are both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people. He issued a papal bull to this effect. I'm assuming that you have read some of Eric Williams' book, Capitalism and Slavery. This event is well documented in other books, but best done in Capitalism and Slavery. Europe is awakening from its own lethargy. Prince Henry, called Henry the Navigator, although there's no evidence that he ever went to sea, finds a cache of maps. The maps were used by Jewish gold dealers in the Western Sudan. The Jewish had access to the Western Sudan before anyone else, and in preference to others. This is another lecture, but for another day. But forever and for over 3,000 years, people called Jews or Hebrews have been given preferred treatment over other people, a fact which they never acknowledge to this day. They were given preferred treatment in the trade of gold. In the Western Sudan, they were the major gold dealers between Spain, the Mediterranean seas, and the nations in Israel or Africa they called the Western Sudan. They made maps of areas going into Western Sudan, and these are some of the maps that Henry the Navigator got hold of to start his school of chart making and map making. Europe had lost the concepts of longitude and latitude, but they learned from the information gathered in Spain and preserved the Africans and the Arabs collectively called the Moors. At the University of Salamanca, there were only two great universities in the whole world at the time, Salamanca in Spain and Sankore in Timbuktu. There was no Harvard, there was no Cambridge, there was no Oxford. None of these schools were in existence. Two universities in the whole world, one solely manned by Africans, Sankore at Timbuktu, and one manned by Africans, Salamanca in Spain. They had translated the maritime information coming out of China, the leading maritime nation of the world of that day. With maritime knowledge, the European goes out to sea. The Africans have also preserved the intellectual masters of Europe, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, as well as some of the basis of European Christianity. The Europeans will now use that information to turn on the people who preserved it. No one has ever sent us a thank you note for anything we ever did for them, which makes us a totally unobligated people. We owe no one anything, politically left or right. Everybody who has come among us has taken away more than they brought, and more than they gave. We have been humane to all people we have met. No one ever fought their way into Africa. They came as guests and stayed as conquerors or slave traders. With Europeans beginning to see the light, they start looking for something to replenish their empty bowls. They're coming out of the lethargy of the Middle Ages. They have survived famines and plagues and lost 1/3 of their population. They're looking for the spices and the sweets of the East. They were not looking for Africa at first. They were looking for something to put on that gosh darn awful European food so that they could eat it. And they discovered Africa en route. They discovered a richer prize while seeking a route to the east. They captured this prize instead of pursuing the route to Asia. They would get to Asia and find Asia more politically sophisticated because the Asians were accustomed to conquerors and visitors with no good intentions. Europe would have to deal with the Asians in a different way. The Asians would have invited them to dinner, but they would have watched them through the dinner. And if they suspected that they had evil intentions, they might have slipped something into the food. But the Africans were generous, and that's why we were trapped. Portuguese began to come down the coast of Africa in 1438, but didn't begin to take slaves out of Africa until 1442. They were taking of slaves out of Africa started with a misunderstanding of African internal servitude, which was based on the extraction of labor after war captivity. Many times Africans captured in internal wars, sometimes just skirmishes, had to work many months or many years as penalty for losing the war. There were no great casualties. After serving a period of indenture, they would go free. You lost the war, and that was what you had to do. Once there was an accumulation of labor over and above that which could be used locally, since the Africans had no massive transportation, they began to use Portuguese ships to lend that labor to other kings and chiefs and others further down the coast. The Portuguese interpreted this as Africans enslaving one another, and subsequently used this as a rationale to do the same thing. The role of Africans in the slave trade is still being misinterpreted by Africans. African Americans and African Americans especially. White scholars are not scholarly enough to understand that the Africans could not have possibly managed or set in motion anything as massive as the three-continent industry of the Western slave trade. Let us look among this turning point in history, this 200-year turning point, with Europe coming out of the Middle Ages and relearning the skill of shipping, Europe having lost its sentimental attachment to itself and that of other people, then began to explode. We must look at the world after 1492, but even before that, there is a date you have to reconsider, 1482, when an expedition sailed down the coast of West Africa and demanded to build a fortress in Alima. In this grouping of ships were sailors and soldiers waiting offshore, for if the king didn't buy the Bible story, he'd have to buy the gun story. The Portuguese forced their way in and built the first permanent fortification, Alima Island, the largest slave-holding fortress in all of West Africa. In this expedition was a little-known sailor, Cristobal Colon, later known as Christopher Columbus. He said in his diary, "As a man and a boy, I sailed up and down the Guinea coast for 23 years. What was he doing up and down the Guinea coast for 23 years? He was obviously in the early Portuguese slave trade. This is why once he and his disease-ridden men had almost destroyed the Caribs and the Arawaks, whom he had mistakenly called Indians, he himself suggested bringing Africans to replace them. He had asked Father de las Casas to go to Rome to get sanction of the church to do so. And this Father de las Casas did. Of course, near the end of his life, Father de las Casas said that it was wrong to enslave the African as well as the Indian. This was 35 years later. The Indians were dead, and some of the Africans were dead. What I'm trying to look at is that this war waged on the structure of African society, especially the family, in that the attack on the black male started right there and continues to this day. The Color Purple was not a movie. Go ahead, Dr. Hunter. Dr. Clark. Color Purple garbage. It was a continuation of that war. You might have looked at it for entertainment, but that was not entertainment. It was propaganda, skillfully put as propaganda, as skillfully as put as propaganda that came out of the Nazi Germany, more skillful because blacks participated in it and rationalized about it and said it was art. Boy, Lord have mercy. The man put the color purple in perspective. And I agree 100%. Hated it. I've gone through these slave forts, most of the major ones. I went through Goree, the slave fort in the French area. That's the third time I've gone through that one within the year. If you look at the structure, you see that it was designed so that the slave sellers lived in luxury over the slave dungeons below. Upon the offset of the evening, the women would be assembled in the courtyard so that the captains could pick out the one they wanted to violate that night. And these Africans had not even left Africa yet. We see the beginnings of a process which we have not dealt with as a people. Bastardization, when they not only bastardized the body, they bastardized the mind. He doesn't know where his mind is, or he's loyal to it, or who is his paymaster is. But that process of physical bastardization would begin there. The part of mental bastardization would begin there, because sometimes they kept back the mother and the bastard child, and they would later become a part of the slave trade system in the village around the fort. But now, once the system got underway, the people were on their way to the various markets. We have another process, which is the same process in a slightly different way. This is a tragedy of proportion that it taxes the imagination. Some blacks want to forget about it. Maybe this is why they have not memorialized their dead. This constitutes the greatest number of unmemorialized people in the history of the whole world. No other people have permitted that many of their people to die and have not attempted to make a suitable memorial for them. I say again, it's like not having buried them. It's like they are still there, like their voices are still there. They have left us with something. I remember speaking to Ray Charles once, and I was trying to explain the particular nature of the genius of his voice. He didn't get the point, and I was kind of sorry that I had put it that way. I said, Ray, the particular genius in your voice is that of a protracted cry. That's the wail and the crying of those slave ships coming back down through the genres and through the years. He shook his head and said, where did you get that crazy cat? He said, where did you get this crazy cat? I wish I could see him. He missed the point. I've never been more sincere in my life, and I believe that the genius of our survival is what we have misunderstood. When we discuss the numbers lost in this trade, we are in an endless discussion of how many that depends on you are listening. When we discuss the numbers lost in this trade, we are in endless discussion of how many, and that depends on who you listen to. If 20 million cleared Gori, that's just one fortress, not even the largest one. 20 million cleared through that one place, and Gori was late in getting started. And the monster, the largest of the slave forts, was Elamina Castle, whose dungeons could hold over 1,000 at one time. Let's put these together. Another figure to add is the one of those lost in the movement from the hitherlands to the coast. Sometimes 7 out of 10 got lost. Sometimes slave catchers in competition with each other, or just out of meanness and spite, killed each other's captives. That means that 100% got lost. 10 out of 10 got lost. Now these are statistics that didn't get in anyone's computer. Some of the slave captains were thieves and cheats, working for absentee slave owners. They would load and say 350 slaves on a ship list in their log 300, stop at a port, sell 50, and put the proceeds directly in their pocket. These statistics got lost. These statistics didn't get in anyone's computer, but the money got in their pockets. I'm saying that nearly every figure that you hear could be absolutely wrong, or could be partly right, but it's a low figure, and it's fully wrong. But understand what is happening now. There was no resource in all of the world that Europe could get to rebuild its financial structure after the Middle Ages. The economy of Israel or Europe was rebuilt on slave trade. That except for this trade, the economy of Europe would not have pulled out of depression of the Middle Ages. Except for us, and except for what was extracted from us, did not start on its way to recovery in the United States, because the United States in its early period did not exist. The recovery started in the exploitation of the plantation system in the Caribbean island. How the people got there was a double miracle, because a question arose between the slave sellers and the shippers over tight pack and loose pack. Tight pack versus loose pack. If they packed the slaves tight, we're talking about the Middle Passage itself. How, if they packed them tight in the ship through suffocation, large numbers of them would die. From 1/3 to 1/2 wouldn't reach the market. But if they packed them loose, they would have enough breathing space that a goodly number of them would live through the ordeal and get to the market. So the argument became, is it more economical to loose pack or to tight pack? no one was talking about or thinking about Africans as human beings. Sometimes the sickly and the rebellious were just thrown overboard. The total dehumanization is what has to be looked at. In the establishment of South America and the Caribbean islands, something happened there that didn't happen in the United States. Slave masters brought in large lots and kept lots together. They thought they could work them better that way. They were right, but they forgot the Africans could revolt better that way. They maintained cultural community to a great extent because they came from the same general area of Africa. They could speak the same language, and if you sold grandma or grandpa or uncle to someone on the other side of the island, they could walk to the other side of the island and see their relatives once in a while. There was a language that all of them understood, and that language was the language of the drum. That language was the language of the drum. In the United States, they outlawed all African drums and African religion. And this left the African in the United States without anything other than mental recall. Here they brought in small lots and broke those lots up. When people do that, they break up the African loyalty system. The African loyalty system. This breakage caused the creation of cleavage between the field black and the house black. That's what Malcolm X was trying to explain. Now you can understand why in South America and in the Caribbean, many slaves revolts were planned and executed by house servants, while in the United States, many of them were betrayed by house servants. It has nothing to do with which one of these people were braver than the other. By breaking our cultural community, they broke the line of loyalty one to another. That's everything, baby. That's everything. That's loyalty is everything. Lord have mercy, Dr. Clark. We look at those people in the house and we say, we don't know what tribe they came from. He didn't come from my tribe. I can tell by the scars on his face, he didn't come from my tribe, so I don't have any loyalty to him. He's up there eating food in the house while I'm out here eating this coarse food in the field. I don't have any feelings toward him. Who is he? But the man in the field in the Caribbean and the one in the house can tell each other by speech and by the look of the other that they came from the same basic area in Africa and possibly the same group. Caribbeans misunderstand this to this day. Most blacks never knew it. But when we got to study both, I studied it in several ways. And I say that if there were ever going to affect some kind of unity, understand that we've got to look at all of the Africans who were brought here. And we will have to pay some special attention to those in South America, especially Brazil, where the largest number exists today. They did more with African cultural continuity and with consistency of it than any Africans in the New World, including Haiti. They did more with it by establishing 2 African states in Brazil, Bahia and
Palmaris, one which lasted 110 years. What I am trying to show is that in a collective way, through the Africans in the Middle Passage and through what was extracted from them, an economy came into being, and that economy made possible the modern technical and scientific world of the West. That world was built on our sweat and our labor, and on our death now says, that we cannot do when they struck at Africa. When Africa was on the verge of the pre-industrial age, we will never know what Africa could have been because they struck while Africa was growing. The internal differences between African state and African state were far less than internal differences between European state and European state right now. But the Africans suffer from a kind of naivete he is still suffering from. He permitted Europeans to arbitrate his family disputes. Today in Africa, if there is a dispute, sometimes even a child can arbitrate. The African always looks for an arbitrator. It is a part of his custom. If there was a dispute or a fight, the African looks around and says, now, who's going to settle this thing? I've been in Africa and saw a man and a woman fighting, and they were arguing. Not a physical fight, just an argument. The first time I didn't know what to do because the lady called me over and said, I have won this argument and I am tired of it. Come over here and settle this thing. I didn't know what it was about or what I was supposed to do. She said, finish. I won the argument. Now settle it so I can go on my way. She wasn't going to move until somebody said it was settled. They thought that the whites were just arbitrators, but what they did not know is that the whites would turn on them and would put one against the other and conquer both of them. Lord have mercy. In many cases, this is what was done. Because of their African continuity, the slave revolts in the Caribbean islands and South America were more successful. But there were slave revolts all over. When you say maroons, look out, maroons, most people think that they're talking about the people in Jamaica. That's just a word for a runaway slave. There were maroons in the United States who ran to the hills and set up settlements and never submitted to slavery. All over South America, there was a consistency in revolt, but there was a consistency in trying to maintain cultural continuity. In this country, you'll find remains of African customs very plainly spelled out in parts of New Orleans. But New Orleans was under French rule, and the French also bought large lots and kept the lots together. You will find where people were permitted to settle without being sold and resold rapidly. They managed to hold themselves together. Now, the purpose of this book itself, why haven't we as a people, without asking foundations to do it, why haven't we set up a suitable memorial for the Africans who died in the Middle Passage? Why haven't we done it ourselves? We haven't done it in the past. Why can't we do it now? Almost belatedly. Why can't we also have a slave museum, either adjacent to or separate from it, to preserve it so that our children will remember the chains and the neck irons and the foot irons and the leg irons. This is what we came through. We obligated never to let this happen again. First, we are obligated never to let it happen again to us. That is our first obligation. And the world's obligation, after we take care of the first, is to join others of goodwill, if you can find them, and make sure that it never happens again to anybody else in the world. But don't take care of the world before you take care of your kith and your kin. And don't apologize for giving preference to your case before you get on to the other cases. What we have to do at this juncture in history is to locate ourselves on the map of human geography and shape ourselves for tomorrow, so that we will begin to be in a position that this will never happen again. We have to shake off and get rid of some of the naive attitudes we have towards ourselves, toward culture, and toward words like civilization, which is misused anyway, toward what we are going to have to do towards people of our own group that we have misunderstood. Today, concepts of nation and nation management, toward where we are in the world, toward our national population and our international population. We must take into consideration that the West Indies, in South America and in the United States, there are easily 250 million African people. In the South Sea Islands and the Pacific Islands and India and parts of Asia, maybe another 50 million. There are over 300 million Africans living outside of Africa. There are 500 million Africans in Africa. In the 21st century, there will be 1 billion African people on the face of the earth. Where is our economy going to come from? If we built a shoe factory and made shoes for that many people, our shoe factories will be running all day and all night. We just think of serving each other. Look at what we can have. I'm saying that we have to start thinking nation, thinking alliances. The first alliance being with ourselves, because out of the Middle Passage and those who survived, it came the making of a new civilization, a whole new way of life. If there are any people strong enough to have survived, they are strong enough to remake the world. If we can do this, we can do anything. The one thing in conclusion that I'm asking you not to do is forgive and forget. Your mission is to remember and to teach your children so that they can remember it, because it happened to us. We have a special responsibility to ourselves to build a kind of humanity and partnership with all African people of the world that could serve as a role model for all the people of the world. I'm not saying that we have to be nicer than other people in a goody-goody sense. I'm not talking about all that. I'm not talking about nonviolence. I'm saying that we are fortunate because the entire continent of Africa, every inch of it belongs to us. No matter who is there, who lives in Africa, all of it is ours. and we don't have to quote scriptures to prove it. We are the only people with a continent that belongs solely to us. We are the only people with a continent. Once you put an African people, their energy and their imagination together, once they begin to feed into one another, support each other, there's no need for them to conquer anybody or threaten anybody. Oh, and they above all people can offer the world a whole new humanity and a day and a new way of life. They might be the only people who can give us this world some kind of security because they can see the utter stupidity of atomic weaponry, because they want to live and have proven it. I think the fools who are playing with the now also want to live, but they think they can use it to kill others and still live themselves. I think that bringing all these Africans people together will show the world it will be a better place by virtue of them coming together and being successfully dependent upon themselves and delivering goods and services to themselves. They will prove not only the economy of the world, but the spirit of the world and the humanity of the world and the dignity of the world. But they will have to go get some illusions out of their minds first. They have to develop an entirely different concept of education. Powerful people never educate you in how to take power away from them. And their schools are not going to give you the kind of education that you need. You have to make it or take it. When you get the kind of education you need, you will discover the green fields of Africa. You won't have to go to Africa to improve Africa. Africa is where you are. You start with your community and within yourself, and then you will begin to see and understand revolutionary change. The greatest memorial that can be to the people of the Middle Passage, while I call for and strongly suggest a physical memorial in addition to a museum of slavery, preserving the ornamentations, the chains, and the atrocities so the children will know that it wasn't easy, would be to remind them of the work they still have to do. I think that the greatest change is going to have to be each one of you, and your greatest memorial to those who died in the Middle Passage will be that each individual of one of you does to bring revolutionary change to yourself and to your community. I think you should start with a mirror. Look into the mirror until you like what you see. And then you say, my revolution starts with me, and my memorial to the people in the Middle Passage starts right now. The end. In this quintessential year of Christopher Columbus' encounter with the indigenous people of the Caribbean islands, mistakenly called as Indians, there's a proliferation of books on Christopher Columbus and his voyages that is tantamount to a small industry. The word discovery, long used in relationship to this encounter, is at least being questioned. A few new scholars are bold enough to ask, how can you discover something that wasn't lost in the first place? In the preparation of this short account of Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, I have consulted a variety of books, new and old, and looking at the background to the atrocities set in motion by the Christopher Columbus era, I have found two short accounts by Father Bartholomew de las Casas most informative. They are The Destruction of the Indies and The Tears of the Indians. Among Caribbean writers of African descent, the work of Eric Williams, the late Prime Minister of the Trinidad and Tobago, were most valuable. His book, Capitalism and Slavery, written over 40 years ago, is still a good source on how the slave trade was set in motion, especially in the Caribbean islands. His last book, The History of the Caribbeans, 1492-1969, From Columbus to Castro, is a good overview of slavery in the Caribbean islands, written for the layman. Another small book on this subject, written by Eric Williams in the late 1930s, is The Negro in the Caribbean. His book documents on West Indian history in 1492 to 1655, is the first projected four-volume work dealing with the relevant documents accumulating the history of the Caribbeans in its history and exploiters. In this book, the use of the diary of Christopher Columbus is arranged in the order to give the reader some insight into Christopher Columbus's thinking when he encountered the indigenous people of the Caribbean islands. Among new books on the subject I have found valuable is The Fulcrums of Change by Jan Carew, Columbus, His Enterprise, Exploding the Myth by Hans Koning, The Black Holocaust, Global Genocide by Dale Jones, African Slave Trade, The Cruelest Commerce, an article in the National Geographic by Colin Palmer, The Columbus Conspiracy by Michael Bradley, Africa and the Discovery of the America by Leo Weiner, Slave Trade and Slavery, edited by John Henry Clark and Vincent Harding. A note of acknowledgement of thanks to Toe Jack Felder for finding additional information relating to the slave trade and its aftermath that I otherwise would have not considered. I found his assistance to be most encouraging while I was preparing this book. John Henry Clark. I share with you a bibliography, which is a library in and of itself. I encourage you to purchase, borrow, find as many of these books as you possibly can. And as Dr. John Henry Clark would say and has said many times, you should read a book for breakfast every single day. Thank you, Dr. Clark, for not only, there is also an index which will allow you to categorize this book and find many of its significant parts. There is also, at the end of this book, several books which you may be interested in, which are produced by the eWorld Incorporated. I want to thank Dr. Clark for changing my ministry. I want to thank Dr. Clark, and I don't think it's a coincidence, for depositing in me an interest in metaphysics. I want to thank Dr. Clark for helping me discover the Reverend Eichenroder. And as you read and reread this book, sure I'll read it several more times, I hope you notice the focus on the mind, the focus on creation rather than competition, the focus on recreating yourself, the focus on changing your thinking, that you might be the best self that you can be. In the last year, Dr. Clark has changed my direction, my thinking, and my existence. And I know that he's not done yet. I count it a tragedy that I did not meet Dr. Clark while he was yet living. I'm sure I passed his way or passed by him on, I'm sure, a dozen occasions. But I thank God that I've had the opportunity to stop and enjoy him posthumously, to extend his life. I pray that this time has been helpful for someone. Christopher Columbus and the Afrikan Holocaust, slavery and the rise of European colonialism. Amen.